Content note. This episode discusses cannibalism in the archaeological record from an educational and anthropological perspective. The discussion is non-graphic and focuses on evidence, context, and ethics, but the topic may still be distressing for some listeners. Please listen with care. Field Notes from the Dead approaches human remains and past behaviors with respect, cultural sensitivity, and academic responsibility. This episode discusses cannibalism solely as it appears in the archaeological record using peer-reviewed research, established forensic and osteological methods, and the goal is to not sensationalize, judge, or dehumanize people of past or present, and to understand human behavior within its environmental, cultural, and historical context. Cannibalism is examined as a survival strategy under extreme stress, a ritual or symbolic practice with specific belief systems, and a behavior that must be interpreted carefully, using patterns of evidence rather than assumptions. We explicitly reject narratives that frame cannibalism as evidence of moral inferiority, savagery, or cultural deficiency. Such interpretations have historically been used to justify colonial violence and cultural erasure. By prioritizing context, evidence, and care, this episode aims to model ethical engagement with difficult topics and to remind listeners that the archaeological record reflects human resilience, complexity, and adaptation, not caricature. Cannibalism is one of the most emotionally charged topics in archaeology. It's often framed as shocking, monstrous, something that marks a group as other. But the archaeological record tells a very different story. So today's episode of Field Notes from the Dead isn't about sensationalism. It's about evidence, context, and what humans do under extreme conditions. We're going to talk about cannibalism as archaeologists understand it. Through bones, cut marks, fractures, and patterns. And why these stories we tell about it often say more about us than what they say about the past. In archaeology, cannibalism is not a moral category. It's a behavioral one. When we talk about cannibalism in an archaeological record, we're asking very specific questions. Were human bodies processed in ways consistent with consumption? But here's kind of how we look for that. Cut marks in specific locations, percussion damage from marrow extraction, anvil and hammerstone impact marks, bone fragmentation patterns, burning consistent with cooking. And here's a really important part. No single mark proves cannibalism. It's the patterns that matter. Context is absolutely everything. Go into a category of cannibalism. Survival cannibalism. What is survival cannibalism? Well, survival cannibalism occurs during extreme stress. Think famine, environmental collapses, isolation, severe cold. This is not a ritual, and it's not belief-driven. It's a biological survival when all other options are completely gone. In these cases, we often see these things. Systematic disarticulation, long bone breakage for marrow extraction, cut marks identical to animal butchery. There's no special treatment of the remains. The bones are treated as food. They're not treated as ancestors, they're not treated as enemies, and they're definitely not sacred objects. Survival cannibalism tells us something important, but uncomfortable. When the systems fail, humans adapt, not because they want to, but because they must. Here's an example. October 1972. Flight 571 would strike a mountain ridge and crash deep into the Andes. The plane took off from Mendoza on Friday, the 13th, October 1972, a fact that was not lost on the rugby team inside. They joked about the date's unlucky symbolism. On board were 45 people, the rugby team, their friends and family, the crew, and a stranger who had paid for a seat last minute so she could get to a wedding. Flying directly over the Andes wasn't possible for this plane. The maximum cruising altitude would have been 6,858 meters, roughly 22,500 feet. But In Kaguga, the highest mountain in the range is 6,960 meters. They would have to follow a U-shaped route about 100 miles south, then into the Andes and over Planchon Pass, where the ridges were lower before they could head north to Santiago. The flight should have taken 90 minutes, but a very inexperienced co-pilot, not prepared for the bad weather, made a mistake. He would turn too soon into the dedicated route. Little did he know this would be the last mistake he ever made. Passengers on board stated they had noticed out their windows how close the mountain range was to them before they felt the plane try to climb and correct the mistakes happening. But it was too late. The plane would nick the side of the mountain range, ripping the top of it off and plunging deep into a ravine. Of the 45 people on board, only 33 survived. The survivors had little to no equipment for the cold, which could get to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit at night, but this did not include the frequent windstorms, dropping it to below negative 33. Doing their best to protect them from the elements, they would try to build makeshift walls from the plane debris. But after more than a week, also the debris and the rations of little food would be non-existent, with meals being said to consist of a square of chocolate over 3 days. The suggestion to the rest of the group was to possibly start consuming the already departed people to supplement the current alive. This wasn't a full win with everybody. Some were holding out hope for rescue. But after day 11, where a survivor was able to get a radio to work and learned that they had called off the search, survivors report this was the point where everyone decided that survival was more important than stigma, and everyone ate at this point. After this, survivors would endure avalanches, blizzards, and dehydration before the group had sent 2 people out to make a Hail Mary hike to get help. After 72 days stranded, the survivors would finally be rescued. This very human act of survival was not religious or malicious, and in fact shows the determination of humans and how they continue to care for the ones around us even when all hope was lost. The survivors talk deeper about their experience in a book and a show that is coming to Netflix as a docu-movie called Society of the Snow. I suggest you check it out. Let's talk a different category, ritual cannibalism. So ritual cannibalism is very different than survival cannibalism. Here, consumption is symbolic. Here's a few things it could be about: absorbing power, honoring the dead, reinforcing group identity, maintaining cosmological balance. In these cases, we often see selective body part use, careful processing, pattern repetition, and they are usually associated with ritual spaces. The body isn't treated as food, or at least it's not treated as food alone, but it's treated as meaningful. This is where modern misunderstandings often cause harm. Labeling ritual cannibalism as savage strips cultures of their worldview and replaces it with fear. Let's go for an example of ritual cannibalism. When we talk about ritual cannibalism, one group that often is mentioned is the Agori people. They're an ancient Hindu Aztec sect, probably about 1,000 years old, and like other sadhus, whose goal is moksha, which is spiritual liberation. But what makes them different is how they approach it. The Agori believe that ideas like purity and impurity, good and evil, are illusions. And then those illusions keep us stuck. So instead of avoiding what society labels as taboo, they confront it head on. They live near cremation grounds, they worship Shiva and Kali, and focus heavily on death as a teacher rather than something that they fear. One of their most controversial practices is their ritual of cannibalism. Importantly, though, the Agori do not kill, and any flesh that they consume comes from the bodies that are already at the cremation sites. For them, this isn't about violence. It's about breaking down the fear, the ego, and the idea that the human body is somehow separate or sacred in a special way. They also use the cremation ash, skull bowls, and extreme acts of renegation to strip away social conditioning. To outsiders, this practice may seem shocking, but within the tradition, they're seen as a fast, though incredibly demanding, path toward enlightenment. So let's talk about something ancient. Let's go to Gough's cave. It's one of the most well-known archaeological examples. Again, Gough's cave in England. Dating to the Magdalenian-period around 15,000 years ago. Here's what the site shows. Extensive cut marks, systemic marrow extractions, human bones processed alongside animal remains. But there's more in Gough's cave. Some of the skulls were carefully modified into skull cups, which we just talked about with the agori. This tells us the behavior wasn't just random. It was likely involved with both nutritional, survival, and ritual meaning. Gough's cave reminds us that human behavior is rarely one-dimensional. Survival and symbolism can coexist over centuries and may have many purposes. So here's what cannibalism is not. Archaeology pushes back against the mainstream idea of cannibalism. Cannibalism is not evidence of moral failure. It's not proof of cultural inferiority. It's not a sign of inherent violence either. But it is evidence of context within society. It's evidence of pressure, of belief, of survival strategies. The bones don't just tell us that people were monsters. They tell us that people were human and not monsters. They were living in conditions most of us have never faced, and we never will. Why does this matter today? Well, the way we talk about cannibalism absolutely matters because these narratives have been used to justify colonial violence, dehumanization, and cultural erasure. And anthropology asks us to slow down, to look at the evidence carefully, to resist easy stories. When we do that, even the most uncomfortable topics can teach us something super valuable. They teach us about resilience, about beliefs, and about the limit of human endurance. Cannibalism in the archaeological record isn't about shock. It's about understanding humans under pressure. The bones don't judge, they don't exaggerate, and they don't sensationalize. But they remember. And if we listen carefully, they remind us to be thoughtful with the stories that we tell about the past and about each other. If you like more stories that are told within the anthropological context and with ethical, careful notes, please follow, subscribe, and share. You can reach all of my contact information if you have questions or want to suggest any kind of topics down in the show notes. Remember, your bones don't lie.